What if I told you that Mattel, one of the biggest toy companies in the world, once had the chance to own Star Wars, but threw it away? And because of that, they spent years trying to fix their mistake, with a muscle-bound warrior called He-Man. From a $750,000 missed opportunity to a toy empire built on a lie, this is the wild, untold story of how Mattel almost lost everything, until He-Man changed the game forever. And trust me, this story has everything: corporate blunders, behind-the-scenes drama, secret identities, and even a showdown between He-Man and Superman. So, grab your sword, channel the power of Grayskull, and let's dive in. Mattel's $750,000 mistake that made their rival a giant in 1976, Star Wars was just a risky sci-fi project, and George Lucas was struggling to find a toy company willing to take a chance on it. He approached Mattel with an offer: pay $750,000 upfront for the exclusive rights to produce Star Wars action figures. If the movie flopped, it would be a disaster. But if it succeeded? The rewards could be enormous. Mattel's CEO, Ray Wagner, didn't believe Star Wars was worth the risk. He turned Lucas down, thinking it was just another passing trend. That decision handed the opportunity to Kenner, a smaller toy company desperate for a breakthrough. When Star Wars exploded in popularity, Kenner's toys became a massive phenomenon. Stores couldn't keep them on shelves. Parents lined up for empty boxes, promising their kids figures that hadn't even been manufactured yet. Meanwhile, Mattel watched helplessly as their competitor dominated the market, making millions off a deal they had rejected. For years, Mattel struggled to recover from what was now seen as one of the biggest blunders in toy history. But redemption would come, through a muscle-bound warrior named He-Man. He-Man, the hero designed to fit every adventure by the early 1980s, Mattel was desperate for a new hit. Toy designer Roger Sweet had an idea: a character who could be anything a kid imagined. His name? He-Man. Sweet wanted a figure that wasn't tied to a single story. He-Man could be a barbarian, a space warrior, or even a superhero, whatever the child playing with him wanted him to be. His name was intentionally simple, designed to be powerful yet vague. Mark Taylor, another designer on the project, crafted He-Man's look, drawing inspiration from Viking warriors and prehistoric men. The team merged elements of fantasy and science fiction, creating a universe where magic coexisted with futuristic technology. This fusion gave Masters of the Universe a unique identity, setting it apart from anything else on the market. Unlike other action figures that relied on movie tie-ins, He-Man's world was built entirely around the toy line itself. This flexibility allowed Mattel to create endless adventures, expanding He-Man's universe in ways that no other toy franchise had done before. But to truly dominate the market, He-Man needed more than just toys, he needed a story. And that's where a marketing lie changed everything. The lie that created a cartoon empire. When Mattel pitched He-Man and the Masters of the Universe to Toys R Us, the retailer wasn't convinced. "How do we know kids will want this?" they asked. "Is there a cartoon?" Mark Ellis, Mattel's marketing director, didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "We already have 2 animated specials in production." But there was a problem: those specials didn't exist. Ellis had just made a promise he couldn't keep. Desperate to cover himself, he scrambled to make it real. He approached animation studios, but most turned him down. Hanna-Barbera wasn't interested. However, Lou Schemer at Filmation saw an opportunity. Instead of just 2 specials, he suggested something much bigger: a full animated series. With no movie to rely on, the He-Man cartoon was designed entirely to sell toys. It was one of the first series of its kind, a 30-minute commercial disguised as entertainment. The gamble paid off. Kids were hooked, and suddenly, Masters of the Universe became more than just action figures. It was a full-blown phenomenon. A single marketing lie had turned He-Man into one of the biggest toy franchises of the 1980s. The He-Man toy line almost had a completely different name before Masters of the Universe became a household name. Mattel had a very different title in mind: Lords of Power. It sounded grand, mighty, and fitting for a warrior-driven toy line. But there was a problem: Mattel's marketing team felt the name had too much of a religious undertone. They worried that parents might hesitate to buy action figures with a name that sounded like it belonged to a biblical epic rather than a fantasy adventure. So, the team went back to the drawing board. They needed something that captured the same sense of grandeur but felt more adventurous, more otherworldly. That's when Masters of the Universe was born, a name that suggested limitless power, epic battles, and an entire universe waiting to be explored. It was bigger than just one hero. It was a title that promised an entire mythology. And just like that, Lords of Power was scrapped, never making it past the early prototype phase. Today, a handful of rare Lords of Power figures still exist, making them some of the most sought-after collectibles for hardcore He-Man fans. The secret identity that didn't exist if you grew up watching He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. You probably remember the iconic moment when Prince Adam raised his sword and shouted, "By the power of Grayskull," transforming into the most powerful man in the universe. But here's a little-known fact: Prince Adam wasn't part of the original story. When Mattel first introduced He-Man in the early 1980s, he wasn't a mild-mannered prince in disguise. He was simply a powerful warrior, a barbarian who roamed the land battling evil. The mini-comics included with the toys told stories of He-Man's adventures, but there was no mention of a secret identity. It wasn't until the 1983 animated series that the idea of Prince Adam was introduced. The show's creators wanted kids to relate to He-Man, not just as a larger-than-life hero, but as someone who, like them, had an ordinary side. This change made his transformation into He-Man even more exciting, turning it into one of the most memorable moments in animation history. Without Prince Adam, He-Man would have just been another warrior. But with him, the show gained an element of mystery, making He-Man's story all the more legendary. The show that revolutionized kids' TV by December 1984, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. The show was pulling in 9 million viewers every weekday afternoon, airing on 166 stations across America and reaching audiences in 37 countries worldwide. At the time, nothing like it had ever existed. Before He-Man, animated shows were usually based on existing comics or fairy tales. But this was a 30-minute commercial disguised as a cartoon, and it worked like magic. Kids weren't just watching He-Man's adventures, they were rushing to stores, begging their parents for the action figures to recreate those battles at home. The show's success completely changed how toys were marketed. After He-Man, companies realized they didn't need a blockbuster movie or a best-selling comic book to sell toys. They just needed a great cartoon. Without He-Man paving the way, shows like Transformers, G.I. Joe, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles might never have become the pop culture icons they are today. Masters of the Universe wasn't just another kids' show, it rewrote the rules of children's television. He-Man changed the way cartoons were broadcast in the early 1980s. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe faced a major problem: no major TV network wanted it. ABC, CBS, and NBC all turned it down. Why? Because back then, weekday afternoon slots were dominated by reruns of classic cartoons like the Flintstones and Tom and Jerry. Networks weren't interested in airing new animated shows outside of the traditional Saturday morning block. But Filmation, the studio behind He-Man, had a bold idea: what if they bypassed the networks altogether? Instead of fighting for a Saturday morning slot, they sold He-Man directly to local TV stations, airing it on weekday afternoons. It was a gamble, but it paid off in a way no one expected. Kids rushed home from school to catch He-Man every day, and ratings soared. The show's success shattered the old TV model, proving that first-run weekday syndication could work. This opened the floodgates for other toy-based cartoons like G.I. Joe, Transformers, and Thundercats, changing children's television forever. Without He-Man, the golden age of 1980s action cartoons might never have happened. He-Man's mother is actually from Earth. Eternia is a land of magic, warriors, and strange creatures, but did you know He-Man's mother isn't from there? Queen Marlena, wife of King Randor and mother to Prince Adam, is actually a human from Earth. In the DC Comics story From Eternia with Death, it was revealed that Marlena was once an astronaut on a deep space mission. During her journey, her spacecraft was knocked off course and crash-landed on Eternia. She was rescued by King Randor, and over time, the two fell in love. Eventually, she became Eternia's queen, and years later, she gave birth to Prince Adam, who would grow up to become He-Man. This twist adds a fascinating sci-fi element to He-Man's origin. While his father is a royal Eternian, his mother's earthly heritage gives him a unique link to humanity. It also raises an interesting question: if Marlena made it to Eternia by accident, could others from Earth find their way there too? A detail like this makes the He-Man universe feel even richer and more mysterious. Skeletor is He-Man's uncle? We all know Skeletor as He-Man's greatest enemy, the ruthless, skull-faced sorcerer obsessed with conquering Castle Grayskull. But what if He-Man's worst enemy was actually family? In the early Masters of the Universe mini-comics, there was a brief mention of Kelder, a long-lost brother of King Randor. It was just a passing reference at first, but fans speculated, who was Kelder? What happened to him? Then, in the 2002 He-Man animated series, the truth was finally revealed: Kelder didn't just disappear. He was mortally wounded, and in a desperate bid to survive, he turned to dark magic. That magic twisted him into the monstrous Skeletor. That's right, He-Man's greatest foe was once his uncle, a prince who had fallen from grace. This revelation added a tragic depth to Skeletor's character. He wasn't just an evil villain, he was someone who had once been part of Eternia's royal family, now consumed by hatred and revenge. Orko's name was changed to save money. Orko, He-Man's floating, bumbling wizard sidekick, almost had a completely different name, Gorpo. It was set in stone, right down to the character's signature outfit, until the animators ran into a costly problem. See, Gorpo had a large letter G on his robe. That might not sound like a big deal, but in animation, every second counts. To save time and money, animators often flip cells to reuse footage. But with a G on his chest, every mirrored frame would be unusable, it would look completely wrong. The solution? Change the name. By swapping Gorpo for Orko, they could replace the G with an O, a perfectly symmetrical letter. Now, animators could flip and reuse his animations without any awkward mistakes. It was a simple fix, but one that saved countless hours of work and production costs. Most fans never knew the reason behind the change, but without it, Orko might have been a very different character, or even scrapped altogether. How He-Man's creative team shaped the 1990s. Many of the minds behind He-Man and the Masters of the Universe didn't just define the 1980s, they went on to shape pop culture for decades to come. Paul Dini, one of the writers, later teamed up with Bruce Timm to create Batman, the animated series, a show that redefined superhero storytelling and introduced Harley Quinn to the world. J. Michael Straczynski, another He-Man writer, would go on to create Babylon 5, one of the most ambitious and influential sci-fi TV series ever made. And it wasn't just the writers. Artists and animators from He-Man helped craft the look of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Gargoyles, and even Spider-Man, the animated series. The influence of Masters of the Universe didn't end when the show went off the air. Its creative team shaped the very fabric of 1990s animation, leaving a lasting impact that fans still feel today. The man behind He-Man's many voices, Lou Schemer, wasn't just the co-founder of Filmation, he was also one of the most unexpected voices of the entire He-Man series. He originally lent his voice to Orko, using the pseudonym Eric Gunden. But that was just the beginning. Over the course of the show, he ended up voicing 18 different characters, including King Randor, Stratos, and even some of Skeletor's bumbling henchmen. Why did he take on so many roles? Simple: to save money. Hiring extra voice actors meant higher production costs, so Schemer stepped in to fill the gaps. His vocal range was surprisingly diverse, making it nearly impossible for audiences to tell that one man was behind so many voices. His contributions gave Masters of the Universe its distinct charm, proving that sometimes, the best performances come from unexpected places. How He-Man broke the rules and changed TV forever. Before He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, toy-based cartoons were practically illegal. The FCC had strict regulations against using television to advertise toys to kids, making it nearly impossible for companies like Mattel to launch an animated series based on their products. But there was a loophole. While major networks were bound by these restrictions, local TV stations were not. Filmation, the studio behind He-Man, took full advantage of this and syndicated the show directly to independent stations. Because of this strategy, He-Man aired across the country without breaking any FCC rules. The results were groundbreaking. Not only did He-Man become a massive hit, but it also changed the way children's television worked. Seeing its success, other toy companies quickly followed suit. Soon, shows like G.I. Joe, Transformers, and My Little Pony flooded the airwaves, creating an entire era of cartoons built around action figures. He-Man toys made an insane $736 million in 1983. Critics dismissed He-Man as nothing more than a 30-minute toy commercial. But if that was true, then it was one of the most successful commercials ever made. In 1983 alone, Masters of the Universe toys raked in a staggering $736 million. To put that into perspective, that's more than what Star Wars action figures made that same year. It was a level of toy success that few brands had ever achieved, and it cemented He-Man as a cultural phenomenon. Kids weren't just watching the show, they were living it. They recreated battles, built their own stories, and collected every new character Mattel introduced. The more figures they released, the more kids wanted. However, the empire wouldn't last forever. By the late 80s, sales had plummeted, and Masters of the Universe eventually disappeared from store shelves. But for a brief, glorious moment, He-Man wasn't just the most powerful man in the universe, he was the king of the toy industry. The secret behind He-Man's realistic movements. If you've ever wondered why He-Man and the Masters of the Universe looked so fluid compared to other cartoons of its time, the answer is rotoscoping, an animation technique invented in 1915 that involved tracing over live-action footage. Filmation used this method extensively, capturing real actors performing He-Man's signature poses and Skeletor's menacing movements, then animating over them frame by frame. This is why He-Man's transformation scene, with Prince Adam raising his sword and declaring, "By the power of Grayskull," looks so smooth and dynamic. It was based on real human motion. This technique gave Masters of the Universe a distinct look, making it stand out from the more rigid, limited animation styles of other shows. However, it was also time-consuming and expensive, which is why some of the same animation sequences were reused multiple times throughout the series. The surprising connection between He-Man and Conan the Barbarian. If He-Man looks like he could have stepped straight out of a Conan the Barbarian comic, there's a reason for that: he almost was Conan. In the early 1980s, Mattel was in talks to produce a toy line based on Conan the Barbarian. But when the 1982 Conan film received an R rating for its violent content, Mattel panicked. A brutal, bloody warrior wasn't exactly marketable to kids. So, they scrapped the idea, at least, officially. Instead, they took the concept of a muscle-bound barbarian hero, toned down the violence, and added elements of fantasy and sci-fi. The result? He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. But Conan's owners, Conan Properties Incorporated, weren't happy. They sued Mattel, claiming He-Man was just Conan with the violence removed. The legal battle dragged on, but Mattel ultimately won, arguing that He-Man was an original creation. Even though He-Man was never officially Conan, his origins are undeniably linked to the sword-wielding barbarian. The He-Man sequel that never happened in 1996, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, was long gone from TV screens, but Lou Schemer, the co-founder of Filmation, wasn't ready to let it die. He had a vision for the next chapter: Hero, son of He-Man. The story centered around Dare, a young warrior raised by Adam and Teela. As He-Man had retired, the next generation needed to step up, and Dare was destined to wield the power of Grayskull. The concept was ambitious. It introduced new villains, expanded Eternia's lore, and promised a fresh take on the franchise. But the biggest challenge? Finding a network willing to take a chance on it. Unfortunately, by the mid-90s, He-Man wasn't the powerhouse it had once been. Networks were moving on to newer trends, and without strong backing, Hero, son of He-Man never got past the early pitch stage. Some concept art and scripts still exist, giving fans a glimpse of what could have been. But as of today, Dare remains just an idea, an heir to Grayskull who never got his chance to shine. The day He-Man fought Superman in 1982, DC Comics did something wild. They pitted He-Man against Superman. In DC Comics Presents number 47, Superman is magically transported to Eternia. But instead of teaming up with He-Man, he ends up fighting him, all thanks to Skeletor's mind control. The battle was intense. Superman, under Skeletor's influence, attacked He-Man with his full strength. He-Man, wielding the power of Grayskull, fought back with everything he had. It was a clash between two of the strongest warriors in fiction. Though He-Man held his own, the fight ended when Superman managed to break free from Skeletor's control. Realizing they were on the same side, the two heroes teamed up to take down the real enemy. This issue remains a fan favorite, proving that even before modern crossovers, He-Man had already gone toe-to-toe with DC's greatest hero. The first action figure movie, and a box office disaster before Transformers, before G.I. Joe, before any other toy-based blockbuster, there was Masters of the Universe, the first live-action film inspired by an action figure line. Released in 1987, it starred Dolph Lundgren as He-Man and Frank Langella as Skeletor. But there was a problem. Instead of following the beloved cartoon, the film was based on the original Masters of the Universe mini-comics. Characters like Orko and Prince Adam were nowhere to be seen, and much of the story took place on Earth, not Eternia. Fans were confused, and the film's budget constraints didn't help. Cost-cutting forced He-Man's legendary battles to take place in generic back alleys instead of epic fantasy landscapes. The dialogue felt stiff, the special effects looked cheap, and even Dolph Lundgren's performance was widely criticized. The result? Masters of the Universe flopped at the box office, making just $17 million against a $22 million budget. It was supposed to launch a franchise, but instead, it became a cautionary tale of how not to adapt a toy line into a movie. She-Ra almost became bigger than He-Man in 1985. Mattel and Filmation set out to do something bold, expand the Masters of the universe by introducing a female lead. Enter She-Ra, Princess of Power, He-Man's long-lost twin sister, created to appeal to a young female audience. The gamble paid off big time. Within months, She-Ra became the number 2 most-watched children's show in America, only behind Transformers. Meanwhile, He-Man, once the king of kids' TV, slipped to number 3. She-Ra wasn't just a female version of He-Man, she had a richer backstory, a stronger supporting cast, and a message of empowerment that resonated with young girls. Parents even praised the show for having a heroic female lead, a rarity at the time. But just as She-Ra was rising, Masters of the Universe as a whole was declining. Toy sales were plummeting, and by 1987, both He-Man and She-Ra were cancelled. For a brief moment, She-Ra stood on the verge of overtaking her brother in popularity. If circumstances had been different, she might have become the true face of the franchise. From one of the biggest business mistakes in toy history to the rise of an action figure empire, Mattel's journey with He-Man was anything but ordinary. But here's the big question, could He-Man make a comeback today? With 80s nostalgia at an all-time high, do you think Masters of the Universe could reclaim its throne, or has its time passed? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this dive into toy history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories from the world of pop culture. Thanks for watching, and until next time, by the power of Grayskull.